The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Okay, let me share my screen. Okay, Courtney, can you see the screen? Okay, great. Okay, hello everybody. Thank you very much for attending our webinar. We're ready to get started now. As you know, the topic of this webinar is integration with SQL databases. So we're going to talk about how customers are creating workflows and forms that integrate with their SQL databases to solve a wide variety of problems. It's just a very common use case. frevvo can do a lot of things with your forms and workflows, dynamic forms, mobile, so on and so forth. But the reality is that a lot of these forms and workflows are simply more useful if they can connect with backend systems like SQL databases and pull data, write data to, et cetera, et cetera. So we're going to talk about that. Let me see if I can put this in full screen. Okay, great. A real quick agenda. The recording's already started. I just wanted to make sure that you knew where to ask questions. You should see a control panel. Probably doesn't have as many, whatever accordion things as are on this panel, but there should be a section there that shows questions. If you have a question, please go ahead and type it into the box, the one that my mouse is on right now. My colleague Courtney is also on the webinar with me, and she will be she'll answer your question directly in the chat window itself. We're going to reserve some time at the end for questions. We'll try to answer as many of them as possible. Very quickly, what are we going to go through? We're going to go through a little database connector introduction just to give you an idea of some of the things that you can do with the database connector, how it works, and so on and so forth, and then go through some examples. The most common examples that customers use the DB connector, frevvo SQL integration for is things like dynamic pick lists, dependent pick lists where the second pick list depends upon the first, and for a master detail type of form. And as I said, we'll be reserving some time at the end for questions. One note, this is a fairly technical webinar. We're going to be talking SQL and JSON and JavaScript, XML, and so on and so forth. It's not just a purely marketing webinar. So just kind of wanted to make sure everyone's aware that this webinar is of a technical nature. We're going to try and get down into how do we actually do some of these things. So the database connector, we talked about a couple of things that people use the database connector for, but it's capable of doing all the 4 CRUD operations. You can certainly read from a database, but you can also create new records. You can update existing records. You can also delete records. So as I mentioned here, I am certainly not aware of anybody who's actually using frevvo forms to delete content from their database, but it is possible. Let's just take a quick look at a couple of examples. Just for you can go to our website here, and under Get Help, under Examples, you come to a page that lists several common examples of the kinds of things that people use frevvo for. You can see purchase orders, employee onboarding, travel, expense, etc. But then there are a couple of SQL examples as well. So real quick, let me just try out a couple of these. And this one is a very straightforward master detail type of workflow form. The pick list at the top shows you a list of customers. Now, this pick list was actually generated from a database. You obviously didn't see that happening here, but we're going to go through and create this pick list. And the bottom half of the form is the detail for that customers. And as you can see, when you select a customer, the system automatically updates the lower half of the form, the lower section down there, with details for that particular customer. So very standard master detail form. All this is done very easily with frevvo, and we're going to go through and look at a slightly different example of master detail, but this one in particular, of how to do this as well. So this is another example. Again, this is the same initial pick list of customers that came from the database. When you select a particular customer, you'll see that the second pick list updates with the list of orders for that customer, dependent pick list. Select a different customer, and you have a different list of orders. In this case, a lot longer. And you select an order, and the lower table now populates with line items for that order also coming from the database. Select a different order, and you'll see that it populates with the line items for that particular order. Okay, so I just wanted to give you a couple of real quick examples of existing sample forms. You can try these out on our website, as I mentioned earlier as well. Okay, so just a quick look at a deployment model, what it sort of looks like over here. This is how the database connector works. You have your database. Now, typically that database is on-premise. And by on-premise, I mean in your data center. It's not something that we control. It's a SQL database. Many databases are supported, pretty much any database with a JDBC driver, which is practically all of them now. We certainly have customers connecting to Oracle, SQL Server, MySQL, most of the common databases. The database, as you know, typically talks SQL. I should also mention that stored procedures are also supported here. And then in the middle is the database connector, which typically will run on-premise with some in your data center. Again, it's certainly we have the database connector running in our cloud. We are capable of running it in our cloud, but that would, in order for it to connect to your database, it would mean that your real SQL database is exposed to the internet, to our cloud system, and most customers don't do that. So the DB connector is also typically running in some sort of DMZ or on-premise server within your environment. And then frevvo itself can be running either in the cloud or on-premise, and it communicates with the database connector over HTTP. So frevvo talks HTTP to the DB connector talks SQL to the database, and all of this communication obviously is bidirectional. Now, let's take a look at some configuration stuff. So the first thing you have to do when you use the database connector is you got to configure it. And there are multiple levels of configuration. So we'll just break it down into each part of that configuration. The most important thing over here is to tell us which database is this instance of the connector connecting to. Now, actually, I misspoke, because a single instance of a database connector can talk to multiple databases. You can have as many databases as you want that one DB connector is talking to. And the configuration is very straightforward. There's a root element called query set, which has a name. It's highlighted in red over there, and we'll see why later on. Just in this case, it happens to be BIRT BERT, capital BERT is the name of this query set. And then there are a few things down there that tell us, well, how do you connect to the database? What's the URL? What kind of driver is necessary? What is the username, password, etc. Pretty standardized stuff. Don't have to worry about the individual details right now. We have all of this stuff documented for most databases. But at the highest level, you have to tell the database connector, okay, here's the database that I want to connect to and what kind of database it is and some credentials to connect to. Once that's done, let's take a look at an example of when you're talking to a database, it's typically SQL or a stored procedure. So here's an example of a really simple SQL query. Select customer number, customer name from customers, order by customer name. Hopefully it's reasonably familiar to most people on the call. It's a very simple SQL query, and it returns a list of results that look like this on the right-hand side. This happens to be a MySQL database. And you can see you've got a bunch of customer numbers and the corresponding customer names on the right-hand side. So you're talking SQL to the database connector. Now, the DB connector itself needs to be aware of this SQL. So I've got a SQL query. So the first thing you do is you configure the database connector to tell it which database to connect to. Then you've got a SQL query. Now you've got to configure, the second part of the configuration is to tell the DB connector, make it aware of this query. And that's, again, another configuration in the database connector's configuration files. In this case, we've given it a name. It's called all customers. So this is just a query. You can choose whatever name you want, and then there are several other parameters that you can add to a query, which we won't get into. One I'll mention here is you can also add a security key, so the query can only be accessed by people who have that key. And then you can add a variety of statements, SQL statements, into a single query, one for each of the CRUD operations. In this case, we've got a retrieve, and you can see that that particular statement, select customer number, customer name from customers, order by customer name, is placed in here. So this is how we are going to let the DB connector know about this query. We've given it a name called all customers. So now we've got the database, we've got a SQL query that connects against the database and returns a result set. We've got the database connector configured so it knows about this particular SQL query. Now what we need to do is the HTTP part. So the database connector converts essentially that data into HTTP or to XML or JSON over HTTP so that frevvo can talk to it. And of course, it does the opposite as well in the other direction, converts it into SQL. So how does that happen? Again, there's a straightforward mapping between SQL and HTTP. In this case, SQL, there are select, or I should say retrieve, create, update, retrieve, and delete operations, and they map to specific HTTP methods, post, put, get, and delete. This is just informational. Typically, you don't really need to worry too much about these things. There's not the connector and frevvo's systems will do most of this work automatically for you. But at the end of the day, there's a nice one-to-one mapping between HTTP methods and SQL queries. So now, if we go back and we look at our query here, we had a select. And that means we're going to, in order to access this select, we're going to issue an HTTP GET request, because GET maps to select. So how does that SQL query, how is that HTTP request constructed? Well, again, you can take a look at this. I've kind of pulled out elements of the mapping that are relevant here, or the configuration that are relevant here. As you remember, we created a query called all customers with the necessary SQL statement. We placed it inside a query set named BERT, which references the actual database we're connecting to. And we simply construct the URL for the HTTP request in this manner. There's a server on which the connector is running, /database/BERT, which is the name of the query set, /all customers, which is the name of the query. And that's all there is to it. It's pretty straightforward. If you had a different query called all products, you would simply call it /BERT/all products.
There's a question, Ashish, about, are we talking about HTTP requests or HTTPS requests?
Oh, HTTPS. It supports both HTTP and HTTPS. Obviously, it depends upon how you configure the database connector. Again, it's just a web app running inside a web server. Typically, you would always use HTTPS. You can even see in this URL down here is HTTPS. So I actually have an instance of the database connector running, and we can just try this out. Turns out that these URLs are capable of returning both XML and JSON. We'll take a quick look at each, and you'll see why in just a minute. So I click on the XML over here, and you see that what's happening is you're getting back an XML document. It has the same information as we saw in the result set of the SQL query: a customer number, customer name, customer number, customer name, customer number, customer name, etc. Except it's in XML format, something that the frevvo form or workflow is able to consume. And we're going to see an example of how to do this exactly. Now, the same information can also be retrieved in JSON format. And again, it's the exact same information: customer number, customer name. Is just a series of rows, one for each customer, customer number, and customer name. Okay, so you can again see the URL is this database server name /database/BERT/all customers, and you're just getting back a list of customers. Hopefully, again, pretty straightforward. What we've done over here, So what we've done over here now is we've got a SQL query. We know that that SQL query returns a result set, a table essentially with 2 columns. We've configured the database connector so it knows which database to talk to and the name of the query. Then we've created an HTTP URL that essentially accesses the database connector. It goes to that specific database, which is referenced in the URL, runs the specific query, which is also referenced in the URL, and it can return either JSON or XML to the frevvo server. Now, these URLs, as you know, can have where clauses and variables. You can also pass those variables on the HTTP URL. We're gonna see examples of that real soon. Okay, so now that we've done that, now that you've got an idea of how the data flows from a SQL result set through the DB connector through HTTP in either JSON or XML formats, let's take a look at how to use the data in your actual forms and workflows. And there are 2 main ways to do that: business rules and data sources. We're going to look at an example, at least one example of each. Business rules are written, in this case, in JavaScript, and they use JSON. They use the JSON data. The data sources use the XML data. Both are equivalent. You can use either. Just typical scenarios are for using business rules are, for example, if you're setting up a single dynamic pick list, you want to use a business rule or a single control. It's easy. It's not very hard. You don't have to create a separate data source, and there are additional steps that you need to take in order to use a data source. But the benefits are that if once a data source is set up, it can have a really, really complex result set with multiple rows, tens of columns that are populating a large number of controls in the form. For that example that we saw about line items for an order, there could be hundreds of line items. It's tedious to write a rule that loops through and sets up all of those fields. So we'll take a look at examples of using both business rules as well as data sources. So here's the first one, a dynamic pick list. So what we're going to do is create a pick list, a drop-down control in our form, and we're going to go and run a query, the same query that we just created, select customer number, customer name, parse the results, and set it up as a pick list. Okay, so let's take a look at how to do that. I'm going to switch to a different browser here. And I'm now logged into frevvo in an account on our cloud system. I've got a database connector that's connecting to my database sitting somewhere else. So here's I've pre-created some of these forms just to save some time since we only have a limited amount of time on this webinar. So here's a simple form called list customers. It's really simple. It has a single control on it. So here's the control called it's a pick list. You can see in this control that the design time options for this particular control are just set to option 1, option 2, and option 3. Obviously, that's not what we want, and that's not what will get displayed eventually once this form runs, because we have a business rule that's now going to go to the database and replace these options with dynamically created options coming from the database. So one other thing I'll note here is that the name of this control is select. It's called select customer, and that's something that's going to be used in this business rule. So let's take a look at the rule. It's very simple. Can I make this big? I don't think we needed to do that. All we're going to do here is once again run that exact same URL, HTTP database BERT all customers. Remember that this URL goes to the database connector and tells it to run the query called all customers against the database defined by the query set BERT. We're going to get, we don't need to pass any parameters. Just because this URL is being invoked from a rule, frevvo will ensure that the DB connector returns JSON. We're going to take that JSON, we're going to parse it, and literally loop over all the results that come back. And let's initially just set it to customer number. So we're going to basically set the option. We're going to set an array of options to the customer numbers, and then set the options of that pick list called select customer to those customer numbers. Long-winded explanation. Let's just run it. If I run this form now here, what you're going to see is a pick list. You'll see down below, by the way, here, when you run this form and while you're testing, you'll see a debug console here that shows you the rule that ran. Here's the rule that ran, and we looped through, and all we did is we set the pick list options to the customer number. Okay, so you can see that all the customer numbers are showing up here in the pick list. Now, obviously, this is pretty user unfriendly. Users have no idea what the customer number means. So what you can do in that case is create the rule like this. So the options of a pick list can be set as value equals display label, basically. So what that means is we're going to set the value of the chosen item in the pick list to be the customer number, but what we're going to display to the user is the customer name, which is a much more user-friendly thing to look at. So again, if we were to run this exact same rule, exact same form, excuse me, you'll see that it runs the rule, but now this time it's retrieving, it's setting the options to, this highlight doesn't work, to customer number equals customer name, etc. So what you see down here is a user-friendly list of customers. If the form is, when I select this particular customer, it's the value of this control is actually going to be set to the customer number. We can see that if we were to submit the form and look at the submissions for that form. Here it is. You'll see that the most recent submission was customer number 121, which I'm hoping, oh, I guess that's not in this data over here. But customer number 121, even though what I selected obviously was a more user-friendly thing. So that's that's our first example. Really simple. Just want to make sure I recap that to be sure we all understood what happened. What happened here is that we created a SQL query that retrieved the list of customer number and customer name. We then configured the database connector so that you can construct an HTTP link that goes to that database connector and tells it to run that SQL query against that particular database. We retrieve that information as a JSON object, which we saw over here. This is the JSON object that came back, and then we wrote a business rule that simply looped through. This looks like a large complex JSON object. It's actually really simple. It's just an array of, I forget how many, I think there are 122 customers with 2 fields in each, a customer number and a customer name. We wrote a loop that parsed through that and initialized the pick list items in the form. Okay, so that's one of the most basic things you can do, but also one of the most common and most popular and powerful things you can do with frevvo. You can, this pick list, once set up, it's always going to go run a SQL query, and you're always going to have the latest information. Now, just as an aside, these dynamic pick lists can also be constructed from all kinds of other backend systems. A very similar mechanism works, for example, if you want to pull information from a Google Sheet, or I think also from a SharePoint, I believe it's a list, from a SharePoint list. So you can pull information from a variety of data sources and create these dynamic pick lists. Okay, so moving on to the next example is a dependent pick list. And this is going to be really, really similar to the first example. All we're doing here is creating a second pick list, which depends upon the first. So again, very common examples. You buy tires for your car. I'm sure you've gone to websites. They'll show you what make is your car. And then they'll ask you for the model. Obviously, the model of the car depends upon the make, it depends upon the manufacturer, and so on and so forth. Dependent pick lists are super common, and basically they boil down to a where clause. So in this case, we're, again, as you hopefully remember by now, the first thing you got to do whenever you want to use the database connector is create a SQL query and configure it in the connector. So in this case, we're creating a query. It's going to be called orders by customer, because now we're trying to retrieve a list of orders that have been placed by a particular customer. So we're going to select order number and order date, whatever, some fields from an order from a table called orders, but where the customer number equals this variable called CNUM. So now the syntax that's used here, you can see that this variable called CNUM is placed in brackets. And that's basically a template, a variable, and we're going to need to be able, in order for the query to execute, you have to tell this query which customer number do you want the list of orders for. How are you going to do that? You're going to pass it as a parameter on that HTTP URL. So very similar again. Again, you've got the same syntax, /BERT /orders by customer, which is the name of the query, except in this case, we have an extra parameter called CNUM equals 242. So in this case, what we're saying is for customer number 242, I want you to retrieve the list of orders for that customer. And this one's for 249. So if we were to run this, what you're going to see is here's a list of orders. You've got whatever, X number of orders for customer number 242. And for customer 249, you'll have a different set of orders. So again, very straightforward. All we're doing here is adding a variable. Again, we've created a select query. We've added a variable. We've constructed a URL. Now let's see how to use this in a form. And again, in this case, we're going to use a business rule because all we're doing is updating a single pick list. We're not really trying to update 25 or 30 controls. So it's pretty easy to do in a business rule. So what does the rule need to do? Again, it needs to do that same HTTP get that we talked about earlier, parse the results out of the pick list, but all it needs to do is it needs to be triggered when you select a customer from the first pick list, because if you remember, the first pick list is set up so that when you pick a customer, you get the customer number as the value, and then you need to pass that value into the URL that gets sent down to the database connector. So let's take a look at how to do this. So here's a form called orders by customer, and you can see it's very similar to the previous form, except that there's a second pick list. So the first one is called select customer. This one is called select order. And again, you'll see that the design time options are simply option 1, option 2, and option 3. Of course, you'll never actually see those. Now, in this form, we happen to have 2 rules. And the first one is the same one that you saw earlier. All it's doing is it's initializing the first pick list with a list of customers. I'll point out in this case, this line 5 here, which says if form.load. So what that means is that this this rule will run when the form loads. So as soon as as the form initializes for the first time, it's going to go off and run this rule, which is going to perform issue an HTTP GET to the database connector, run the query, get the JSON, initialize the pick list. So we have our list of customers. Now the second rule here is going to depend on the first pick list. So when should it run? It should run whenever the value of that the first pick list changes, which essentially means when I select a customer. So whenever I select a customer, I want it to go and issue an HTTP GET. In this case, it's very similar to the first one, except we're passing that parameter, and the value of that parameter is whatever I select is essentially the value of the first pick list, which is going to translate into whatever I selected, the customer number for whichever customer I selected. Okay, so this URL will translate into something like app.frevvo database per orders by customer $CNUM equals 242 or 330 or 229 or whatever the heck the customer number is in the database. And then again, we're simply going to loop over that JSON, and we're going to set the list of options for that, the list of choices for that second pick list dynamically based on what was chosen. So let's try it out. When I run this form over here again, what we're going to see here is you'll see that first rule that it ran as soon as the form was loaded. It says triggered by form.load. It ran off and got all the list of customers. The first pick list is set to a list of values. You can see that the second pick list has jumped in it right now. Typically, you would disable this pick list at this time. I just forgot to do it. When I select a customer from the list below, you'll see here this happens to be customer number 242. So it issued that HTTP GET for customer number 242. We got a list of orders, and down here now you see the list of orders for that particular customer. If I go off and choose a different customer, you'll see again, as soon as I change the customer over here, that rule runs. This is customer 249, so I got a different list of orders. And you can do that obviously for any customer in here. Unfortunately, some of them don't have orders, but this one does. And as soon as you keep changing that pick list, the list of items in the second pick list changes. Okay, so that's another very, very common use case. Something that a lot of customers do. I'm sure it's pretty obvious to you. It's a super common business case scenario that people encounter a lot of times on their forms, where you've got multiple dynamic lists. And obviously, you can see how this can be extended down into as many dependent pick lists as you want. You can have 3, 4, 5 levels deep because the choices in the third one could depend upon whatever you choose in the second, and so on and so forth. And that's kind of what we're going to take a look at right now. The third and final example that I have here. And this one is more complicated. So we saw how you can create a simple rule that doesn't use a parameter, a second rule that does use a parameter, so a SQL query with a where clause. Now we're going to take a look at something more, something different, which is a list of line items. So this is a situation where after you pick the order from the second pick list, the order has a list of line items, and each line item has a description, a price, an MSRP, a quantity, a subtotal, whatever. I forget what exactly is in it. We're going to take a look at it again. But the point is that, first off, the number of line items in a particular order varies. It can be 1, 2, it could be 100. Depends on what was actually placed in that order. And then each line item has a number of fields. So we don't want to do this, we can do this in a business rule, but it's tedious. You have a table, and the table is displaying a list of line items. If you try to do this in a business rule, you have to make sure that the table has a necessary number of rows. If there are too many rows in the table, you have to shrink the table so that it doesn't display unnecessary rows. Then you got to set each individual piece of data in that table using the JSON. A bit tedious, doable, but there's a better way. So in this case, we're going to use XML and XML schema. So once again, as with everything in the database connector, the first thing you got to do is define your query. Once the query is defined, in this case, what we're going to do is we're going to use XSD stands for XML schema definition. So we'll generate an XML schema. We're going to upload it and add controls for the query. We'll generate these controls automatically from that XML schema, and then we're going to connect that generated set of controls to the database using the same mechanism we saw earlier, which is that HTTP URL. So let's just get right into it and take a look at how that's done. So again, here's the query. So query is we gave it a name. It's called order details by order. So in this case, we're going to get the list of details for a particular order from, I guess, from multiple tables in this case. So essentially doing a join from the order details in the products table where order number equals this variable called onum. So this is a SQL query. Nothing particularly fancy about it. It's just going off and getting a list of line items for a particular order that was placed. Let's first take a look at the schema. So remember the steps that we described here are we're first going to generate a schema for this query. We're then going to upload that schema. We're going to generate controls, and then we're going to connect it to the database. So let's take a look at the schema. The DB connector will just generate that schema for you. So here it is. And you can see in here a couple of things I'll point out. We're not going to go into all the details of the schema. You really don't need to worry too much about this. It's just something you just stick in frevvo and it knows how to handle it. But I'll point out a few things. You'll see here that there are these things in here that ensure that whatever data is created by the form for the schema will conform to it. And what that means is that if the database requires a column, and let's say there's a quantity and price in here that are required, what that means is that the database has set it to non-nullable. So if a column can be nullable in the database, it will be optional in the form. If it cannot be nullable in the database, it will be required in the form. In this case, the database says that products are varchar 70. I think it's varchar 70, which means you can have at most 70 characters. So the form will enforce exactly that same constraint as well. And data types are enforced as well automatically. So there's not a whole lot you have to worry about over here. It just happens automatically in frevvo. Okay. So that's how you generate a schema. And now once the schema is generated, we're going to now connect it to the form. So let's take a look at how we do that. Okay. So here's the form. I'm gonna start with the previous form. I mean, instead of showing you a pre-created form, let me create it. So I'm going to make a copy of this orders by customer form, the one that we created earlier. Something like that. We're going to call this form. What we're going to do here is we're going to generate the controls. We're going to automatically generate controls in the form based on the schema that was generated. Now, remember, I mentioned to you that you have to upload the schema into frevvo. I've already done that to save some time. And you'll see that's documented. It's pretty easy. It's literally clicking an upload button and uploading the schema file. In this case, here's the schema. I'm going to delete this as well because I've copied it. Okay, so here's the schema that here's the list of data sources in this form. So I'm going to go into data sources here. I'm going to click new from XSD. Now I generated a schema called order details by order. And here's the list of elements in that schema. So I'm just going to click plus over here. I think I'm doing this right. And you'll see that the data source called order details by order was added to my data sources here. Now, if you remember, in the actual schema, which unfortunately I popped down, but I can always get it back, you'll see that the order details by order has product, quantity, price, description, and MSRP. And this directly corresponds to the SQL query. It has product name, quantity, product, quantity, price, description, and MSRP. So what we're going to do is we're going to go off and add product quantity, price description, and MSRP into our form here. Now you can add these things one by one, but I don't want to bother doing that. I'm just going to click plus at the top, and it's going to go off and generate all the controls for that particular order details by order. Now you can move this around in the form. So I'm going to move this. It doesn't make sense to have it at the top. So I'm going to move it down here. I don't think I really need that outer section. I'm going to move it out, delete that outer section. This is a little cumbersome looking at this as a list of 5 controls, one below the other. So we can rearrange those. You can certainly go to each control over here and change its width. I can make it longer and shorter or do any of that sort. But instead what I'm going to do here is, since this is a repeating thing, I'm going to go in here and I'm going to click display as table, which is now going to, instead of displaying it as a section with arbitrary number of controls arranged however I want it to display this as a table. Okay. Inside this table, you can do whatever you want in here. You can move this description. You can move fields around. You can configure the table. You can do whatever you want when it comes down to this table. Okay. So now what we've done over here is we've got these 2 pick lists. As you know, the first pick list is generated and the second pick list is generated dynamically depending on the first pick list. What we want to do now is generate the contents of this table below depending on the order, on whatever was selected from this order's pick list. So how do you do that? You do what's called set up a doc URI. Okay, we generated a schema. Now what we're doing is we generated the schema, we generated the controls using the data source. Now what we're going to do is connect that data source to the query. So in this case, here's the syntax for the URL that you use. We already saw this. Very familiar. It's PERT, the name of the database, the name of the query, and then the variable. I'm going to go in here. This Chrome always on. I'm going to set these parameters. I'm going to go in here. Here's doc URIs. Send. I'm going to click on this manually set document URIs. I'm going to find the order details by order document, and I'm going to set its URL. So I need to change this to select order. So, and then I'm going to finally say I'd like to set this to the get method, because if you remember, get maps to reading or retrieving information in the database. So let's click submit over here. And I know we did a whole bunch of things over here, so let me just recap real quick. We created these pick lists, you saw that already. But what we want to do now is add a table at the bottom, a complex data structure which can retrieve an arbitrary number of rows of data, each row having multiple fields in it of different types. So what we did is we created a query, we generated an XML schema from that query, we added it to frevvo. That appears here as a data source on the left-hand side. We then generated a bunch of controls from that data source. We decided we didn't like what they looked like because there were too many fields in there, so we then clicked a button and rearranged that into a table. And then finally what we did is we took this data source and connected it to the database connector using that HTTP query. And of course, it's a dynamic query because we want this to change whenever the order changes. So you pass a parameter. So let's take a look at how that works. Let's hope it works. I didn't make any mistakes. I don't think so. So I've got a list of customers. Now I'm going to go off and select a customer. Once I select a customer, I get a list of orders. Once I select an order, now you'll see how the system went off, ran a query, get order details by order for that particular order number. It gets back an XML document, and we can always run this. We can go and take this, copy paste it if we want, and check it out. You'll see here's the XML document. Order number 10136 has 1995 Honda Civic model, 36 of them, blah, blah, blah. All of these model cars. And you'll see how the table below updated automatically to have the description, product, quantity, price, etc. If I select a different order, I don't have to go off and write code that adds rows, make sure that I have the right number of rows, etc., etc. The system just takes care of all of that for me. Now you can see this doesn't look great, so I don't really like what this looks like. So I'm going to go off and move this description back to the right. And then I'm going to go and reset this table. So I'll just make up some widths for the columns. I don't know what they should be. What's that add up? Maybe that adds up to almost 100. But we're going to just set this column so the description is a little bit wider. So this column is going to look a little bit nicer. All that happens, that has no effect at all on the data. So you can change the fields, you can change the look and feel of the form, you can change labels, you can change colors, you can change whatever you want in terms of look and feel. It just doesn't matter because the data is coming from the database. It's completely bound to the fields are bound via the XML schema to the data coming from the backend database. And whenever I select an order, it automatically updates. It changes the number of rows, columns. I didn't have to write any code to do that. And this is, pretty complex functionality that's being handled automatically for you. Now, one thing we're not going to get into right in this webinar, we don't have enough time for, but you can. What we showed you so far was reading data from the database. Now, I can equally easily create a brand new order, click plus, add products, quantities, prices, whatever. Those can come from the database as well, the product description and the prices. And I can then when I click submit, I can set up the database connector instead of a retrieve query with a create query that creates a brand new order. I could also set up the DB connector with an update query. So if I were to say, I want to change this order, so instead of 34, I change this to 54. When I click submit, the DB connector, or not only did I change this to 54, but I don't want the Titanic, so I delete that from this table. I could click plus and I could add something more to this table. So when I submit this form, the database connector is smart enough to know, okay, I deleted the Titanic, so it's going to run the delete query to remove that particular row from the orders. I created a new row, so it's going to run the create query to add a new line item to that order, and I modified the quantity of a specific row, so it knows how to run the update query to update that particular line item for that order. So it's really smart and capable of just knowing how to do the right things depending on what actions were taken in the form, without the user having to worry about it and figure out right code to do it. Most importantly, okay. So I apologize if that was quite a bit to digest, but hopefully you can see that the capabilities that the database connector brings to these forms. And of course, we only showed you forms, with the same exact functionality also applies equally well to workflows. You can use any of this functionality in your workflow as well, route it around, do all of the other stuff that frevvo provides for workflows as well. I showed you this. So I wanted to finish up by providing you links to some resources. We have a lot of information on this DB connector. So first off, there's a tutorial, and that's pretty comprehensive. So if you look at this tutorial, it's very comprehensive. It really explains exactly how these queries are constructed, URLs are constructed, how the DB connector works. It goes through the first 3 examples that I went through on this webinar itself, but then it also does show you how to create an order. So how do you write an insert statement and create a brand new order, how to add details to that order, updating, deleting, and so on and so forth. So the tutorial is super comprehensive. It takes between an hour and a half to 2 hours to go through. If you're really interested in using the database connector, we highly recommend going through the tutorial. Might seem like a lot, but there's a lot of repetition in here, and by the end of the tutorial, you'll really get the hang of how to use the DB connector. Let's see. We also have detailed documentation. I guess I didn't put a link to it over here. In the same, along with that tutorial, you'll see there's a lot of documentation on installation, configuration, how to use stored procedure, security, data, how to set up the database connector in a secure manner, how to configure SSL, set up these query keys. The connector automatically protects your data from SQL injection. You don't need to worry about it. It just takes care of it automatically. We also do offer a number of training classes, and Courtney can correct me, I'm pretty sure there is a training class that is specific to the DB connector. It may not be scheduled.
It's more specific to their environment. So we would schedule this more one-on-one
Okay.
with customers.
Okay, so we can offer you a training class on the database connector. As Courtney mentioned, it's typically it's not typically a group lesson because it's typically targeted towards your specific environment. And then we already looked at these at this detailed documentation on installation, configuration, stored procedures, security, etc., regarding the database connector. And then aside from that, in general, we've got an extensive help center. You can get help. The chat window down there. Certainly contact us. We've got a number of examples, videos, webinars, infographics, and so on and so forth on our website that gives you information about frevvo. So thank you for attending. Hopefully that was useful. Learn how powerful the DB connector is, how you can create super dynamic forms and workflows that connect to your connector. I think we have a few minutes for some questions.
We have a very great question, actually.
Okay.
Any word on when version 9 will be available for on-premise?
Any word
It's
on when
available.
version 9 will be available? I actually don't know.
It's available as of yesterday. It is available.
Okay. Well, it turns out version 9 was released yesterday. So I guess it's available for on-premise right now. If you're having trouble finding out how to get it, just contact our support, and we'll be more than happy to help you with that question.
It should be in the documentation under.
It's in the documentation under
in-house installation guide, and yeah, it should be right. That way I can defend the link directly.
Okay.
So there's Megan put the announcement right in the chat there, or in the question channel. So there is a question on using the database connector for cloud tenants. Is that supported? Did you cover
Sure. The question was, can the database connector be used for cloud tenants? Is that supported? The short answer is yes. As I showed you over here, the database connector doesn't care where your frevvo form sits. All it's doing is it's receiving HTTP requests. And frevvo really doesn't care where the DB connector sits either. It's just issuing HTTP requests. Now, in practice, in most cases, people will run that DB connector in their data center and on-premise environments. And that's simply because if we run it in our cloud, we can do so. But what that means is that your database, your SQL database is accessible from the internet. And most customers don't want to do that. Now, we have many customers running frevvo forms and workflows in our cloud, connecting to the DB connector running in their DMZ, which then connects to their SQL database. It's not hard to set up. It's secure. We've done it many times, so we're more than happy to help you if that's something that you need to get done.
And how easy is it to connect to multiple databases using this?
Sure. So the question was, how easy is it to connect to multiple databases using this connector? It's very easy. As I showed you in the configuration, you just create in the configuration for that connector, you simply create multiple query set elements in here. Of course, you got to give each one a unique name, and each query set represents a single database that you connect to. If for whatever reason you want to have multiple query sets connecting to the same database, you can also do so. And people have done that, I think, for security reasons. I can't remember exactly why, but they did do it for those reasons as well. So bottom line, very easy. It's no problem at all. Okay. All right, great. Well, thank you very much for attending. Looks like we're done with the questions. We appreciate it. We are going to make a recording of this webinar available, and we will send you an email as soon as that's available. So thank you again for attending. Have a great day.